The snow fell on the third morning without sound, not the gentle silence of winter settling over farmland or cathedral rooftops, but the absolute suffocating quiet that descends when something enormous has stopped, when a thing that once shook the earth beneath your boots simply ceases to exist within the landscape that bore it. It was January, the year was 1903, and somewhere in the upper reaches of the Michigan Peninsula, on a plateau scoured clean of every tree that had once stood between the horizon and the gray sky above it, a machine the size of a city block had disappeared. Not gradually, not piece by piece, sold for scrap or auctioned to creditors. Vanished, as though the forest it had consumed had finally consumed it in return. The men who had worked it called it Der Eisenries, the Iron Giant, a steam-powered log-hauling locomotive system so massive, so brutally engineered, that its operators measured progress not in miles per hour, but in acres per day. At its peak, it processed 47 acres of old-growth white pine every 72 hours. 47 acres. Trees that had stood for 200 years, reduced to numbered timber stacks and sawdust clouds before the week was out. It burned 11 tons of coal daily just to hold pressure. Its boilers stood 19 feet tall. Its drive chains, imported in sections from a foundry in Dusseldorf, weighed more than a loaded freight wagon per link. The men who fed its furnaces worked in 14-hour rotations and lost, on average, 2 fingers per season to the mechanisms that never, under any operating condition, slowed down. The investors who financed it called it a revolution. The lumber barons who leased its contracts called it a miracle. The engineers who built it, a small, precise team out of Cincinnati, called it something they never expected, irreplaceable, because when it vanished, no one built another, and the forest, what remained of it, did not grow back, not in any of their lifetimes, not in their children's, perhaps not in ours. This is the story of a machine that worked exactly as designed and destroyed everything because of it. There is a particular kind of madness embedded in certain industrial achievements, not the madness of incompetence or recklessness, but the madness of pure, uncompromising logic carried to its absolute conclusion. The Iron Giant was not a failed machine. That is the first and most important thing to understand about it. It did not break down prematurely. It did not collapse under the weight of poor engineering or miscalculated tolerances. It performed from the first morning of its operation in the autumn of 1898 to the last recorded entry in its operator's logbook in January of 1903, with a mechanical consistency that its builders would have considered vindication and its inheritors should have recognized as catastrophe. It was built to clear forest. It cleared forest. Every gear, every drive chain, every pressure valve, and steam coupling was engineered toward a single measurable outcome: the maximum extraction of white pine timber from the upper Michigan interior in the shortest operationally viable time frame. And it succeeded, so completely, so efficiently, so without deviation from its designed purpose, that it consumed the very resource that justified its existence. This is the paradox at the center of its story. Not that the machine failed, but that it succeeded so absolutely it made itself unnecessary. The forest that had taken 2 centuries to grow, that had been surveyed in 1891 as containing an estimated 1.4 billion board feet of merchantable timber, was functionally exhausted within 5 operating seasons. 5 seasons. The machine had not malfunctioned. The business model had not collapsed. The market for Michigan white pine had not disappeared. The trees had simply run out. And here the paradox deepens into something darker than simple corporate miscalculation. Because the men who financed the Iron Giant, the consortium of 7 lumber investors operating under the name Great Lakes Meridian Timber Company, had been warned, not once, not in passing, but in formal written correspondence from 2 separate sources. A forestry surveyor named Edmund Carruthers, who submitted a depletion timeline to the consortium in March of 1899, and the machine's own lead engineer, a quietly methodical man named August Vreel, who included in his operational report of November 1900 a single paragraph that his employers chose to interpret as pessimism rather than precision. Vreel wrote, "At current extraction rates, sustainable operational zones will be exhausted no later than the winter of 1903. No contingency relocation plan exists. The machine cannot be moved." That last sentence carried its own terrible weight. Because unlike the portable sawmills that had preceded it, unlike the ox-drawn skidding operations or the river drive systems that could follow the timber northward or westward as one stand gave out and another beckoned, the Iron Giant was fixed infrastructure. Its track network covered 63 miles of laid iron rail. Its central processing platform sat on a poured concrete foundation 12 feet deep. Its boiler house was a permanent structure, brick-built, with a chimney stack that had become a landmark visible from 11 miles in clear weather. It had been designed for permanence because permanence implied confidence, and confidence, in the language of industrial investment, implied returns. The investors had built a machine too large to move into a forest too finite to sustain it. They had engineered their own ending with the same precision they had engineered everything else. And when January came, cold and absolute and indifferent, there was nothing left to extract and no way to go elsewhere. The giant had eaten everything within reach. And then it had stopped. Before the iron came, there was silence of a different kind. The white pine forests of the upper Michigan Peninsula in the latter half of the 19th century were among the most dense, most ancient, and most economically coveted stands of timber on the North American continent. They stretched in an unbroken canopy across an estimated 4 million acres, a sea of resinous green so vast that early surveyors, sent north by the Federal Land Office in the 1840s and 1850s, returned with reports that read less like technical assessments and more like dispatches from another world. The trees themselves were not merely large. They were old in the way that geological formations are old, not measured in human lifetimes, but in accumulated centuries of patient, incremental growth. The white pine, Pinus strobus, grows slowly in its early decades, it hardening its core against the violence of northern winters. By the time a specimen reached 100 years of age, its trunk might measure 30 inches in diameter. By 200 years, 50 inches was not uncommon. The record specimens documented by the federal surveyors of 1851 exceeded 200 feet in height and were estimated at upward of 350 years of age. These were not trees, they were architecture, living infrastructure built by time itself. The Ojibwe people who had inhabited these forests for generations understood this in practical terms that required no romanticism. The pine provided shelter material, canoe timber, resin for waterproofing and medicine. More importantly, the forest as a system, its shade regulating snowmelt, its root network stabilizing the sandy glacial soils beneath, its canopy moderating the violent temperature differentials of northern Michigan winters, was the organizing principle of the entire regional ecosystem. 14 species of migratory bird nested in its upper reaches. Brook trout populated its cold, shaded streams. White-tailed deer wintered in its southern corridors, where the canopy broke the wind. The first commercial logging operations reached the Upper Peninsula in the early 1870s. And following the exhaustion of the Lower Peninsula, stands that had fed the sawmill cities of Saginaw and Bay City through the previous 2 decades. These early operations were crude by later standards, hand-felling with 2-man cross-cut saws, horse and ox skidding to frozen river corridors, spring river drives that floated timber south to the mill towns. They were destructive, certainly, but they were also slow. Limited by the pace of human and animal labor, they could not outrun the forest's own capacity to regenerate in their wake, at least not immediately, not completely. The arrival of steam changed the calculus entirely. By 1885, steam-powered skidders, cable systems anchored to portable donkey engines, had accelerated extraction rates dramatically. By 1890, narrow-gauge logging railroads had penetrated the interior, eliminating the dependence on frozen river corridors and extending the operational season from its traditional winter window into a near year-round enterprise. The forest was retreating now, not metaphorically. The tree line was physically moving northward and westward as the logged zones expanded behind it. The cut-over land left behind a chaos of slash, discarded branches, broken tops, bark debris, that dried through summer into one of the most catastrophically flammable landscapes in North American history. The fires of the 1870s and 1880s in Michigan's cutover regions were not accidents. They were the logical consequence of an industrial process that extracted value and abandoned waste without mechanism for remediation. Into this accelerating destruction, in the autumn of 1896, arrived the surveyors of the Great Lakes Meridian Timber Company. They came with theodolites and chain measures and leather-bound ledger books, and they spent 8 weeks cataloging what remained of the old-growth interior. Their final report, submitted in February of 1897, estimated the standing timber value of their target zone at $42 million in 1897 currency. It was the last great stand. Everyone in the industry understood this. The question was not whether it would be cut. The question was how fast. The answer to that question was already being designed in a machine shop in Cincinnati by a man named August Vreel. August Vreel was 34 years old when the Great Lakes Meridian Timber Company retained his firm in the spring of 1897. He was not, by the standards of his era, a celebrated engineer. He had no landmark bridges to his name, no published theoretical works, no portrait hanging in the halls of a professional institution. What he had was a reputation, specific, undecorated, and worth considerably more in practical terms than public recognition, for solving problems of industrial scale that other engineers had declined to attempt. His firm, Vreel and Hauser Mechanical Engineering of Cincinnati, Ohio, occupied the upper floor of a narrow brick building on Reading Road, and employed, at the time of the Meridian contract, 7 men, 3 draftsmen, 2 machinist consultants, 1 structural calculator named Morris Hauser, who was Vreel's partner in name and his conscience in function, and a young apprentice from Cologne named Dieter Kloss, who would, before the project ended, become the only member of the team to travel north and see the machine operate in person. The commission was straightforward in its ambition and staggering in its specifics. The Meridian Consortium wanted a timber extraction system capable of processing a minimum of 30 acres of standing old growth per 72-hour operating cycle. It needed to function across terrain that conventional logging railroads found marginal, the rolling, glacially scarred interior plateau of the Upper Peninsula, where bedrock outcroppings and seasonal wetlands made standard track laying expensive and unreliable. It needed to operate through the Michigan winter, which meant sustained function in temperatures that regularly fell below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. And it needed to be built, tested, and operational within 18 months. Morris Hauser, upon reading the commission brief for the first time, set it down on his desk. She looked at Vreel across the narrow office and said, "They want a machine that does not exist." Vreel's response, as Hauser recorded it in his personal journal that evening, was characteristically brief. "Then we will make it exist." What followed was 14 months of work that the draftsmen who survived it would later describe, in the few accounts that have been preserved, as the most sustained and consuming engineering effort of their professional lives. Vreel slept 4 hours a night during the design phase. He filled 43 notebooks with calculations, revisions, material specifications, and structural load analyses. He corresponded with foundries in Pittsburgh, Dusseldorf, and Birmingham, England, negotiating the fabrication of components that had never been manufactured to these tolerances or at this scale. The central concept was not, in its basic principles, entirely novel. Steam-powered cable skidding systems were well established by 1897. Logging railroads were common throughout the northern timber regions. What Vreel designed was a synthesis, a permanent high-capacity central processing platform, anchored to a radiating network of lightweight iron rail lines that could be extended, rerouted, and reconfigured as the extraction zone expanded outward from the central hub. The platform itself was the machine's defining achievement. It housed 4 independent steam boilers, each capable of sustaining 180 pounds per square inch of working pressure. These fed a central drive system that powered simultaneously 2 lateral cable drums capable of hauling loads of up to 40 tons across distances of 3 miles, a mechanical log deck capable of sorting and stacking 12-foot timber sections at a rate of 1,000 board feet per hour, a debarking apparatus of Vreel's own design, and the locomotive units, 4 of them, each weighing 22 tons, that moved timber along the rail network to the central platform from the active cutting zones. The boilers alone required a dedicated coal supply chain. Vreel calculated fuel consumption at 11 tons per 24-hour operational day and designed a coal delivery rail spur connecting the installation to the nearest standard gauge freight line, 41 miles to the south. The total installed weight of the system, including rail network, platform, boiler house, and rolling stock, exceeded 4,000 tons. The concrete foundation for the central platform required 6 weeks to pour and cure. The entire installation cost, when the final accounting was completed in the autumn of 1898, came to $812,000, a figure that represented, in 1898 terms, one of the largest single capital investments in the history of Michigan's timber industry. It was, by any measure of the era, a marvel. Industrial correspondents who made the journey north to observe the first operational trials in October of 1898 returned with accounts that ranged from awed to breathless. One correspondent for the Detroit Free Press, writing in November of that year, might describe the machine in operation as resembling a small city that had decided, collectively, to go to work. Vreel himself made the journey north only once, in September of 1898, to oversee the final assembly and the first pressure tests. He stood on the observation platform above the boiler house for 2 hours, watching the mechanisms turn, listening to the harmonics of 4 boilers at working pressure reverberating through the iron superstructure beneath his feet, and said nothing that any of his team recorded. Dieter Kloss, standing beside him, noted only that Vreel's expression throughout those 2 hours was not pride. It was something closer to recognition, as though he understood, standing there in the gray September light above a machine that had not yet destroyed anything, exactly what he had made. The construction of the iron giant did not begin with steel or steam. It began with water, specifically with the problem of water, the meltwater lakes and saturated peat bogs that the retreating glaciers of the last ice age had scattered across the upper Michigan interior like wounds that never fully healed. The plateau that Meridian had selected for the installation site was, on its surface, deceptively solid. Beneath that surface, at depths ranging from 4 to 19 feet, lay alternating strata of compressed glacial till, waterlogged organic matter, and fractured bedrock shelves that behaved under sustained vertical load, with the structural reliability of wet paper. Vreel had anticipated this. His site survey correspondence from the summer of 1897 contains 17 pages dedicated solely to subsurface load distribution, a level of geological attention unusual for industrial engineers of his era, most of whom regarded the ground beneath their installations as a fixed and cooperative constant rather than a variable requiring active management. His solution was the foundation system that his structural partner Morris Hauser privately referred to as the other machine, the one buried underground that no investor would ever see or photograph or cite in a prospectus, but without which the visible machine above it would have sunk, tilted, and torn itself apart within a single operating season. The foundation consisted of 340 driven timber piles, each one a 60-foot white pine log, cut from the very forest the machine would later consume, pressure-treated with coal tar, and driven to bedrock refusal by a steam-powered pile driver that Vreel had shipped north as the first piece of equipment to arrive on site. These piles, arranged in a grid pattern beneath the planned footprint of the central platform, were then capped with a continuous grillage of creosoted timber beams, over which a reinforced concrete mat 12 feet deep and 110 feet square was poured in a continuous operation that lasted 6 days and required the labor of 212 men working in rotating shifts. The concrete alone consumed 480 tons of Portland cement, all hauled north on the dedicated supply rail spur in a logistical operation that took 11 weeks to complete before a single structural element of the machine itself could be erected. This was the invisible architecture, the part of the story that the industrial correspondents did not write about because it happened underground, in mud, in autumn rain, without the photogenic drama of great iron components being lifted into position by hand-operated cranes. But it was the foundation, literally, upon which everything else depended. The erection of the platform superstructure began in February of 1898, in conditions that tested the tolerance of both the men and the materials. February in the upper Michigan interior is not winter in any temperate sense of the word. It is a sustained, methodical assault. And any temperatures during the erection phase average minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The structural steel, fabricated in sections at a Pittsburgh mill and shipped north in 40-foot lengths, contracted measurably between the ambient temperature of the fabrication shop and the installation site, requiring Virial's team to adjust bolt hole alignments on site, using hand-reamed corrections that had not appeared in the original drawings. Iron becomes brittle in extreme cold. This was not unknown to engineers of the period, but it was frequently underestimated in practice, particularly by those whose experience was limited to more temperate construction environments. Vriel had accounted for it. His material specifications called for a carbon content in the structural steel that maintained adequate impact toughness down to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, a specification that had added approximately 12% to the fabrication cost and generated a pointed letter of objection from the Meridian Consortium's financial director, which Vriel had answered in 3 sentences and never revisited. The boiler installation was the operation that Dieter Klaas, in his later account, described with the most technical precision and the most evident awe. Each of the 4 boilers arrived at the site in 3 sections: shell, upper drum, and firebox assembly, fabricated by the Babcock and Wilcox Company of New York, and shipped under a contract that specified delivery tolerances of 1/16 of an inch on all mating flanges. They were offloaded from flat cars, moved on temporary timber skidways to the boiler house foundation, and erected using a system of hand-operated chain hoists running on overhead gantry beams that Vriel had designed specifically for this purpose, and which were dismantled and removed once the boilers were in position. The first boiler reached working pressure on the 14th of August, 1898. Vriel was in Cincinnati. He received the telegram at his office at 3:30 in the afternoon, read it, placed it in the project file, and continued working. The drive chain system, the component that the men who maintained it would come to regard with a combination of professional respect and visceral fear, was the final major element installed. Fabricated in Dusseldorf by the engineering firm of Haniel and Lueg, the chains were shipped across the Atlantic in sections and arrived at the installation site in September, each link weighing between 80 and 120 pounds, depending on its position in the drivetrain. The installation required specialized rigging knowledge that none of the available local labor possessed. Vriel had anticipated this as well. He had arranged for 2 Haniel and Lueg installation engineers, both named with a coincidence that the American workers found darkly comic, Heinrich, to travel from Germany to Michigan for the sole purpose of supervising the chain installation. They arrived in August. They spoke no English. They completed the installation in 19 days, shook hands with Vriel's site supervisor, and returned to Dusseldorf without, as far as the surviving records indicate, leaving any written account of what they had seen. The first full operational trial took place on the 4th of October, 1898, all 4 boilers at working pressure simultaneously, all drive mechanisms engaged, the locomotive units moving on the rail network for the first time under load. The log deck cycling through its processing sequence with actual timber, the first trees felled for the purpose of testing the machine that would fell all the others. The trial lasted 6 hours. 2 minor steam leaks were identified and repaired. 1 drive chain required retentioning. The log deck sorting mechanism jammed once, briefly, and was cleared by a maintenance worker named Carl Sundstrom, who would lose the index finger of his right hand to that same mechanism 11 months later under nearly identical circumstances. Everything else worked. Vriel received the trial report in Cincinnati on the 9th of October. He read it, made 2 marginal notations in pencil, and wrote a single-line response to his site supervisor. Begin commercial operations on schedule. The machine was ready. The forest was waiting, and between them, there was nothing but time, and far less of it than anyone with a financial interest in the outcome was prepared to acknowledge. Every great industrial system contains within it a flaw that its designers understood and its investors refused to see. This is not a statement about engineering incompetence. It is a statement about the structural relationship between technical knowledge and financial motivation, a relationship in which the flow of information is never neutral, never complete, and never without consequence. The Iron Giant's flaw was not mechanical. Its boilers did not leak beyond the tolerances Vriel had specified. Its drive chains did not fracture ahead of their calculated service intervals. Its rail network, laid across terrain that had given every previous logging railroad in the region serious operational problems, that held its gauge and its grade through 5 Michigan winters, with only the routine maintenance that Vriel's operational manual had prescribed. The flaw was geographic, and it had been visible from the beginning to anyone who chose to look at the maps with arithmetic rather than ambition. The installation site had been selected for 3 reasons that made complete sense within the framework of a single operating season and complete nonsense within the framework of a 5-year extraction program. First, it sat at the center of the densest concentration of merchantable timber in the Meridian Survey Zone, meaning that in the initial seasons, the machine's cable reach and rail network could access high volumes of standing timber with relatively modest infrastructure investment. Second, the site's elevation and drainage characteristics made it the most geologically suitable location for the permanent foundation that the machine's weight required. Third, and most candidly, it was the location that the consortium's financial director, a man named Roland Petch, who had never visited the Upper Peninsula and conducted all his site assessments from the survey maps spread across his office desk in Detroit, had identified as optimal. What the maps showed clearly, to any reader willing to trace the timber survey boundaries outward from the central installation point, and apply the machine's documented extraction rate against the estimated standing volume in each concentric zone, was this: the accessible old-growth timber within the maximum operational radius of the rail network, a radius constrained by the practical economics of laying and maintaining track across the interior plateau's difficult terrain, would be exhausted in approximately 5 seasons at the machine's designed throughput capacity. Edmund Carruthers, the forestry surveyor who had submitted his depletion timeline to the Meridian Consortium in March of 1899, had performed exactly this calculation. His methodology was not sophisticated by later standards of forest inventory science, but it did not need to be sophisticated. It needed only to be honest, and it was. His report projected functional timber exhaustion of the accessible zone by the winter of 1903 to 1904 at the latest, and by the autumn of 1902 at the earliest, depending on whether Meridian chose to extend the rail network into the more marginal terrain at the zone's periphery. The consortium received Carruthers' report, acknowledged it in a brief reply, and did not alter their operational parameters in any measurable way. Vriel's own warning, contained in his November 1900 operational report, was more precise and more pointed than Carruthers had been. He had spent the previous 2 years monitoring actual extraction volumes against his original throughput projections and found, to his evident professional discomfort, that the machine was outperforming its design specifications, not by a catastrophic margin, perhaps 12 to 15% above projected daily volumes, but consistently, reliably, season after season. The Iron Giant was eating faster than its blueprints had assumed it would. This was the result of an optimization that had occurred organically within the operational workforce rather than being designed into the machine. The timber fallers who worked the active cutting zones had, over the course of 2 seasons, developed a falling pattern and bucking sequence that fed timber to the cable drums in a more continuous and less interrupted flow than the original operational model had assumed. They had, without being asked and without receiving any additional compensation for doing so, made the machine more efficient, and in doing so, they had accelerated its own obsolescence. Vriel wrote in his November 1900 report, "Revised extraction rate projections indicate accessible timber exhaustion no later than winter 1903. At current operational pace, sustainable zones will be depleted before any relocation or network extension program could be designed, financed, and implemented. The machine cannot be moved. No contingency exists." The phrase, "the machine cannot be moved," was not rhetorical. It was a statement of physical and economic fact. The central platform, with its 12-foot concrete foundation, its 4 interconnected boiler installations, and its integrated drive mechanism, the entire apparatus had been designed and built as permanent infrastructure. Moving it would require, at minimum, the demolition of the boiler house and drive platform, the extraction of the foundation piling, the fabrication of a new foundation at a new site, and the reconstruction of the entire superstructure. Vriel's private estimate, which he did not include in his formal report, but which survives in a letter to Morris Hauser dated December 1900, put the relocation cost at no less than $600,000, roughly 74% of the original installation cost, and the relocation timeline at no less than 3 years. Then the Meridian Consortium had not budgeted for relocation. They had not planned for it. In the financial architecture of the original investment prospectus, The machine operated, extracted, generated returns, and was eventually decommissioned in place when the timber was gone. The standing timber was the asset. The machine was the tool for converting the asset to revenue. When the asset was gone, the tool's purpose was fulfilled, and its fate was irrelevant. This was the logic of extraction without continuation. It made complete financial sense and complete geographic nonsense simultaneously. Roland Petch, the consortium's financial director, responded to Vriel's November 1900 report with a letter dated January 1901 that contained in its second paragraph the following assessment. Mr. Vriel's projections, while technically detailed, reflect a conservative operational outlook inconsistent with the performance record of the installation to date. The consortium is confident that timber resources within the operational zone will sustain commercial extraction through the 1904 season and beyond. Vriel did not respond to this letter. There is no reply in the surviving correspondence files. He simply continued with the methodical precision that defined every aspect of his professional conduct to track the extraction volumes, update his depletion projections quarterly, and watch the numbers converge toward the winter he had already named. He was not wrong. He was simply not listened to. And in the industrial history of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the distance between those two conditions was, more often than not, measured in the suffering of men who had no voice in the correspondence at all. They came from everywhere that poverty and promise intersect, from the exhausted copper mining camps of the Keweenaw Peninsula, where the ore veins had thinned and the company towns had begun the slow contraction that precedes abandonment, from the cut-over regions of Wisconsin and Minnesota, where men who had spent a decade logging followed the industry northward and eastward as a sailor follows the wind, not by choice but by the absence of any alternative, from Sweden and Finland and the German-speaking regions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, men who had crossed an ocean with a specific and practical understanding that their labor was a commodity to be sold at whatever price the market would bear, that which in the upper Michigan interior in 1899 was $1.60 per 10-hour shift for surface workers and $2.10 for the boiler crew, whose shifts ran 14 hours and whose work environment maintained an ambient temperature in the vicinity of the firebox doors of approximately 140 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the weather was doing outside. At peak operation, in the winter season of 1901 to 1902, the Iron Giants workforce numbered 431 men. They lived in a camp that had grown over 3 seasons, from a collection of temporary bunkhouses into something that functioned uncomfortably and inadequately as a small permanent settlement. There were 11 bunkhouses, each sleeping between 35 and 40 men in 2-tier wooden bunks. There was a cookhouse capable of feeding 200 men per sitting, which meant that the workforce ate in 2 rotations and that the men coming off night shift ate their main meal at 6 in the morning alongside the men going on to day shift, a circumstance that compressed all social interaction into a brief, loud, multilingual interval over salt pork and boiled potatoes. There was a company store, operated by the Meridian Consortium at markups, that the men understood and resented, and had no practical means of avoiding, since the nearest independent commercial establishment was 31 miles south on the supply rail line and accessible only on the single rest day per fortnight that the operational schedule permitted. There was a blacksmith shop, a tool storage facility, a small medical station staffed by a physician's assistant named George Trant, who had trained for 2 years at a Detroit hospital, and whose qualification for this posting consisted primarily of his willingness to accept the salary the consortium offered, which was not sufficient to attract a fully licensed physician. Trant's injury log, which survives in fragmentary form in a Michigan State archive, is one of the most unsparing documents produced in connection with the Iron Giants operation. In the operational year of 1901, he recorded 214 injuries requiring treatment. Of these, 67 involved lacerations from the log deck sorting mechanism, 41 involved burns from steam or hot metal contact, 22 involved crushing injuries from the cable drum operations, and 11 involved injuries to the hands and fingers from the drive chain maintenance procedures that required workers to reach into operating mechanism spaces to clear jams before the system's designers had incorporated adequate safeguard provisions. a deficiency that Vreel had noted and flagged in his 1900 report, and that the consortium had not funded the modification to address. 7 men died in connection with the Iron Giant's operations across its 5 operational seasons. The Meridian Consortium's official incident reports categorized all 7 as resulting from worker inattention or procedural noncompliance. Trant's private notes, written in a smaller hand in the margins of his official log, do not always agree with this categorization. The men who maintained the boilers occupied a particular stratum within the camp's informal social hierarchy, respected, avoided, and regarded with the specific deference that communities extend to those who perform necessary and dangerous work that the majority would refuse at any offered price. The boiler crew of 4 men per shift worked in an environment of sustained noise and heat that conventional language is inadequate to describe, and that physiological science of the period was only beginning to study. The sound pressure inside the boiler house at full operational capacity had been measured by Vreel's installation team during the initial trials, at levels that caused temporary hearing impairment in personnel exposed for more than 40 minutes without ear protection. The boiler crew wore cotton waste packed into their ears. They communicated by hand signal and lip reading, a skill they developed within weeks of beginning work, and which several of them retained as a permanent adaptation long after they had left the machine's employ. The timber fallers, the men who worked the active cutting zones ahead of the machine's cable reach, were the most physically remote from the Iron Giant itself, but the most directly responsible for its function. They worked in teams of 2, a faller and a bucker, moving through the standing timber in a pattern choreographed by the zone foreman to maintain a consistent flow of material to the cable pickup points. In good conditions, meaning temperatures above -10 and no more than 2 feet of fresh snow on the ground, a competent 2-man team could fell, buck to length, and cable hook between 40 and 50 trees per 10-hour shift. In the deep winter conditions of the Michigan interior, this number fell to between 25 and 35. The fallers were paid on a piece rate that theoretically rewarded high production. In practice, it rewarded high production up to the point where the cable drums and the log deck could absorb the incoming volume, beyond which additional felled timber simply piled at the pickup points until the machine caught up. Several zone foremen, in their communications with the camp superintendent, complained that the piece rate system created perverse incentives that resulted in timber being felled faster than the machine could process it, leaving large quantities of bucked logs exposed on the ground through freeze-thaw cycles that degraded the timber quality and reduced its mill value. These communications were acknowledged and not acted upon. The nights in the bunkhouses were loud with the sounds of men sleeping in the compressed and democratic proximity that industrial labor camps impose. Snoring, coughing, the particular deep and troubled breathing of men whose bodies are exhausted beyond the threshold where sleep is restful. In the deep winter months, the bunkhouse stoves burned through the night, and the temperature inside still fell, by morning, to levels at which condensation froze on the interior wall, surfaces nearest the exterior boards. They talked, on the rest days, and the brief evenings between the dinner, sitting, and lights out, about the things that men in industrial camps have always talked about: wages and foremen, injuries and remedies, the places they had come from, and the places they intended to go when this work was done. They talked about the machine with a familiarity that had grown, over seasons of proximity, into something that occupied the space between respect and animosity. They called it the Giant. They spoke of its moods and its appetites as though it were a living thing with preferences and tempers, which was not mysticism, but the practical language of men who understood, from direct experience, that a system of this complexity and this power developed operational characteristics that no blueprint had anticipated and that only sustained human attention could manage. They did not talk, at least not in any recorded account, about what happened when it was finished. When the trees ran out and the cables went slack and the boilers cooled for the last time, perhaps because the end was too abstract, too far from the immediate demands of the present shift and the next meal and the specific pain of a back that had been carrying weight for 14 hours. Or perhaps because, on some level that required no formal education in forestry or engineering to access, they already knew. They had watched the cutting zones expand outward from the central platform, season by season, watched the forest retreat before them, like a tide going permanently out, watched the slash fields grow and the exposed sandy soil begin to blow in the summer winds that now had nothing to stop them. They knew what a finished thing looked like. They were building it, acre by acre, every day. The winter of 1901 to 1902 was the Iron Giant's apex, not its most profitable season. That distinction belonged to the second operational winter of 1899 to 1900, when the accessible timber was still dense and close, and the rail network had not yet been extended into the more marginal terrain at the zone's periphery, where track-laying costs eroded the per-board-foot economics that the consortium's quarterly reports celebrated. The winter of 1901 to 1902 was something different from merely profitable. It was the season in which the machine operated at the precise intersection of maximum physical capacity and maximum available resource. The brief terminal moment when a system built for total extraction meets the last sufficient abundance of the thing it was built to extract. It was, though in the language of ecological science that did not yet exist in the vocabulary of 1901, the final bloom before collapse. The operational logs for that winter, maintained by Camp Superintendent Harold Bjornson in a series of leather-bound ledgers that passed eventually into the holdings of a Michigan Historical Society, record a consistency of daily production that reads, across its weeks of entries, less like an industrial log and more like a natural phenomenon. Day after day, through November and December, and the deep core of January, the machine processed between 42 and 49 acres of standing timber per 72-hour cycle. The variation within that range was governed almost entirely by weather, specifically by snowfall rates. Since accumulations above 30 inches per 48 hours slowed the timber faller's advance regardless of the machine's own appetite. Bjornson was a practical man with a Scandinavian directness that expressed itself in his log entries as an almost aggressive economy of language. His daily entries rarely exceeded 3 lines. Production volume, equipment status, weather notation, occasionally a personnel observation, an injury, a dismissal, a hiring. Reading across months of these entries, the compression of language begins to feel not like efficiency, but like a kind of psychological necessity, as though recording too much of what was happening in more expansive terms would require acknowledging what it meant. The forest was disappearing at a rate that a man standing on the observation platform above the boiler house could perceive, week by week, as a physical recession of the tree line. In October of 1901, the nearest standing timber to the central platform was approximately 1 mile distant in the dominant extraction direction, the northeast quadrant, where the densest remaining old-growth concentration lay along a series of low glacial ridges. By February of 1902, that distance had grown to 2 miles and 3/4. This expansion of the extraction radius had direct operational consequences that Bjornson recorded with his characteristic brevity. But that carry, in retrospect, the weight of systemic warning. Cable haul distances were increasing. The time required to move a load from the felling zone to the cable pickup point, days and from the pickup point to the central platform, was lengthening incrementally but persistently. Rail maintenance requirements were increasing as the network expanded into terrain that had been left for last, precisely because it was the most geologically difficult. The per-acre extraction cost was rising even as the total extraction volume remained high, because the machine was working harder and traveling farther to maintain the same output. Vreel, tracking these figures from Cincinnati, updated his depletion projection in December of 1901. The revision moved his estimated exhaustion date forward by 6 weeks relative to his previous projection. He sent the updated figures to Bjornson and to Roland Petch at the consortium's Detroit office. Bjornson filed the report in his records without comment. Petch's office did not respond. The men in the camp felt the change in ways that Bjornson's log did not record, and that no official document was designed to capture. The veterans, the men who had been at the installation since its first operational season, noticed it in the texture of their daily work. The walk from the bunkhouses to the active cutting zones had been growing longer each season, a fact that the piece rate payment structure did not compensate for, since travel time was not paid time. By the winter of 1901, the farthest active cutting teams were walking 90 minutes each way between camp and their working zone, in minus 15-degree temperatures, in darkness, in the morning, going out, and the evening coming back, Because at that latitude in December, the sun was present for fewer than 8 hours, and the operational schedule was not organized around its availability. The cable drum operators at the central platform noticed it differently, in the tension loads on their equipment, which were increasing as haul distances grew, and in the frequency of cable failures, which rose from an average of 1 per month in the first operational season to 3 per month in the winter of 1901 to 1902. A cable failure on a loaded drum was not a minor inconvenience, it was a violent event. The energy stored in a tensioned cable hauling a 40-ton timber load across 2 miles of terrain releases, upon failure, with a force that the men who had survived such events described in terms that make clear they understood they had been within a specific and measurable distance of death. 3 cable failures in the winter of 1901 to 1902 resulted in injuries. None was fatal. And Trant treated all 3 in his medical station and noted in his private marginalia that the increasing failure rate was a direct consequence of operating the cables at load and distance combinations that exceeded their original design parameters. A fact that was arithmetically obvious from Virial's original equipment specifications, and that no one with the authority to reduce the operational tempo had shown any inclination to act upon. Despite these accumulating indicators, the winter of 1901 to 1902 was the season that the Meridian Consortium's annual report celebrated most effusively. Total timber extracted, 241 million board feet. Revenue generated at prevailing mill prices, $4,600,000 against operational costs of $812,000, yielding a net operating return of approximately $3,800,000, the highest single-season return in the installation's history. Roland Petch's letter to the consortium's investors, dated March of 1902, described the season as confirmation of the installation's extraordinary productive capacity and a vindication of the board's confidence in the original investment thesis. It was the last annual report that used the word confirmation. The following season's report would use different language. There would be no report after that. The machine entered the summer maintenance season of 1902 with its boilers descaled and its drive chains inspected, and its rail network extended, at significant cost, into the 2 remaining accessible timber zones that Vriel's updated maps identified as still containing commercially viable standing volume. The maintenance crew that performed this work, a reduced summer workforce of 89 men, noted in their maintenance logs that the central platform structural steel showed measurable fatigue cracking at 3 connection points on the log deck's support framework. The cracks were repaired by a welding procedure that the maintenance supervisor, a man named Toivo Makinen, privately considered inadequate for the loads the structure would experience in the coming operational season. I.A. Makinen submitted a written recommendation that the connection points be reinforced with additional gusset plates before operations resumed. The recommendation was approved in principle by Bjornson and forwarded to the consortium's engineering liaison in Detroit, who approved the expenditure in July and then, in August, deferred it to the following maintenance season, on the grounds that the fabrication lead time for the gusset plates would delay the start of the 1902 to 1903 operational season by 3 weeks. 3 weeks, against a structural risk that Makinen had formally documented, against a depletion timeline that Vriel had formally projected, against an accumulated record of operational stress indicators that, read together and honestly, all described a system approaching the boundary of its sustainable function from multiple directions simultaneously. The 1902 to 1903 operational season began on schedule in October with all 4 boilers at working pressure and the drive mechanisms engaged and the timber fallers advancing into the last 2 viable zones with a speed that the thinning density of the remaining old-growth stands made, for the first time, visibly inadequate to the machine's appetite. For the first time in 5 operational seasons, the Iron Giant was faster than the forest in front of it. The men in the cutting zones noticed it first, as they always did. The trees were smaller here, in the marginal terrain at the extraction zone's periphery. Second growth mixed in with the old growth, more gaps in the canopy, more blowdown. More ground that had to be traversed between productive felling sites. The rhythms that experienced fallers had developed over seasons of working dense, uniform, old-growth stands did not translate efficiently to this different, diminished landscape. Production volumes in October of 1902 averaged 31 acres per 72-hour cycle, down from the 42 to 49 of the previous winter's peak. Bjornson noted the decline in his log with his customary 3 lines. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. The numbers said everything that 3 lines of language could not improve upon. Winter came early that year. By the 3rd week of November, snowpack on the extraction plateau had reached 44 inches, and temperatures had fallen to levels that had not been recorded at the installation since its first operational season. The oldest hands in the camp said the cold had a different quality to it that year, heavier, more settled, as though the winter had decided, this time, not to leave. They were not wrong, but the cold was not the only thing settling in. The first sign was silence from the northeast cable drum. Not a catastrophic silence, not the violent snap and recoil of a full cable failure, which the men had learned to recognize and fear as a distinct and terrible sound. This was a gradual silence, a slowing, the particular acoustic signature of a mechanism operating under load that exceeds its available power, a deepening of tone, a laboring quality in the drum's rotation, that the operators who had worked the station for 3 seasons recognized as wrong before any instrument confirmed it. The date was the 9th of January, 1903. The northeast cable drum served the last commercially viable cutting zone, a stand of mixed old growth and mature second growth timber on the far side of the second glacial ridge, 3 miles and 400 yards from the central platform. It was the furthest active haul distance the installation had ever attempted. The cable on this drum was the longest in the system, 4 miles of 7-inch steel wire rope, weighing 41 tons fully deployed. It had been installed at the beginning of the 1902 to 1903 season as a deliberate extension beyond the original design parameters approved by the consortium as the only available means of accessing the remaining timber volume within any economically justifiable reach of the platform. Vreel had not been consulted on this extension. His contract with the Meridian Consortium had concluded at the end of the 1900 operational season, not renewed by mutual agreement, though the surviving correspondence suggests the agreement was more mutual on the consortium's side than on Vreel's. He learned of the cable extension from Bjornson, with whom he had maintained an informal correspondence, and wrote back a single paragraph that Bjornson preserved in his personal papers. The drum bearings were not specified for this load at this distance. The boiler capacity is insufficient to maintain working pressure under the increased demand. You will lose the northeast drum before February. I am sorry I cannot offer a better assessment. Bjornson received this letter on the 3rd of January. He read it, placed it in his personal correspondence file rather than the official operational records, and did not alter the operational schedule. 6 days later, the northeast cable drum began to slow. The camp's response to the drum failure unfolded with the organized urgency of a workforce that had dealt with equipment problems before and understood, from experience, the difference between a recoverable mechanical setback and something more fundamental. The drum was taken off load. The boiler crew increased pressure to compensate for the reduced operational capacity, pushing the number 3 boiler, the oldest of the 4, with 17,000 operational hours logged against a design service life of 20,000, to 187 pounds per square inch, 7 pounds above its rated working pressure. The number 3 boiler held, but it held at a cost that Trant, summoned to the boiler house to treat a steam burn suffered by a fireman during the pressure increase procedure, had noted in his medical log with an uncharacteristic departure from clinical language. The boiler is making a sound I have not heard before. I am not an engineer, but I do not think it should sound this way. The mechanical assessment of the northeast drum, conducted over 2 days by the camp's maintenance crew under Toivo Makinen's direction, confirmed what Vreel had predicted. The drum's main bearing had failed, not through material defect, but through accumulated fatigue under operating conditions that had exceeded its design load for the previous 11 weeks. The bearing could not be replaced in the field. The component required workshop fabrication that the camp's blacksmith facility could not perform. A replacement would need to be ordered from the supplier in Pittsburgh and shipped north on the supply rail spur, a process that Makinen estimated at a minimum of 6 weeks. 6 weeks. In January, with the remaining accessible timber in the northeast zone uncut. with the other 3 cable drums now carrying the full operational load that 4 had previously shared, with the number 3 boiler running above its rated pressure, with the structural fatigue cracks at the log deck connection points, the ones that Makinen had recommended reinforcing the previous summer, and that the consortium had deferred, now visibly propagating under the increased load concentration. Bjornsson sent a full situation report to the consortium's Detroit office on the 12th of January. He requested authorization for the bearing replacement order, approval for a temporary reduction in operational tempo to relieve stress on the remaining equipment, and guidance on the consortium's intentions regarding the season's remaining extraction targets given the circumstances. The consortium's response, transmitted by telegraph on the 14th of January, authorized the bearing replacement order and declined the operational tempo reduction. The extraction targets for the season were to be maintained. Makinen read the telegraph response when Bjornsson showed it to him and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "They want us to run 3 drums at full load, with 1 boiler above pressure and cracks in the deck frame." Bjornsson confirmed this. Makinen nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has been told something he already knew and wished he did not. The second failure came on the 18th of January. The log deck sorting mechanism, the apparatus that had jammed and been cleared by Carl Sundstrom in the installation's first operational season, that had jammed repeatedly in subsequent seasons, that Vril had flagged in his 1900 report as requiring safeguard modifications that were never funded, seized completely during the evening shift. The seizing was caused by a combination of factors that Makinen's subsequent written assessment identified with careful precision. Ice accumulation in the mechanism's lower sorting tray, resulting from a seal failure in the overhead steam heating system that had been keeping the mechanism operational in sub-zero temperatures. Increased load cycling from the reduced cable capacity following the drum failure. And the propagating fatigue crack in the support framework, which had progressed to the point where the deck structure was deflecting measurably under operating load, misaligning the sorting mechanism's moving components by a margin small enough to be invisible to the eye and large enough to cause catastrophic jamming under sustained cycling. The deck seized at 9:47 in the evening. The drive chain serving the deck mechanism, unable to stop against the seized mechanism's resistance, continued to transmit power for approximately 4 seconds before the chain itself failed, not at a link, as chain failures typically occur, but at the connection to the drive shaft, shearing the mounting hardware and allowing the chain to release under tension. The energy released by that release destroyed the drive shaft housing. Maa bent the secondary drive frame and sent a section of chain weighing approximately 300 pounds across the interior of the platform in a trajectory that passed through the space where 2 workers had been standing 40 seconds earlier and had moved to clear a timber jam on the incoming feed deck. Both men were unhurt. They stood in the sudden silence of the failed mechanism and looked at the damage around them and did not speak. Makinen assessed the damage through the night. His written report, submitted to Bjornsson at 6 in the morning on the 19th of January, was the most detailed document he had ever produced in connection with the installation. It ran to 11 pages. Its conclusion occupied a single short paragraph. The log deck mechanism cannot be repaired in the field with available resources. The drive shaft housing requires foundry fabrication. The secondary drive frame requires complete replacement. Estimated repair timeline, assuming immediate authorization of all required orders, 10 to 14 weeks. Operational resumption before April is not possible. Operational resumption before the timber resource is fully exhausted is, in my assessment, unlikely. Bjornsson sat with this report for 2 hours before responding. Then he sent 2 telegraphs. One to the consortium in Detroit, transmitting Makinen's assessment in full. One to August Vril in Cincinnati, which said only, "It is as you projected. January, I wanted you to know." Vril's response arrived the following morning. "I know. I am sorry for the men." The consortium's response arrived 3 days later, on the 22nd of January. It authorized Makinen to obtain repair cost estimates from qualified suppliers and instructed Bjornsson to maintain the camp workforce at current levels, pending a board decision on whether to proceed with repairs or initiate an orderly decommissioning of the installation. The board meeting was scheduled for the 14th of February. In the interval between the 22nd of January and the 14th of February, three things happened that removed the decision from the board's hands entirely. The number 3 boiler, running above its rated pressure for 11 consecutive days, developed a longitudinal crack in its upper drum shell on the 26th of January. The boiler was taken offline immediately, a decision that required no authorization because Makinen made it unilaterally and informed Bjornsson afterward, which was exactly the correct sequence and which Bjornsson recorded in his log without criticism. With 3 cable drums offline or inoperative and only 3 boilers at working pressure, the installation could no longer sustain meaningful commercial operations. The supply rail spur, which had been showing deteriorating track conditions in its northern section since November, was blocked by a derailment on the 1st of February when a coal delivery locomotive left the rails on a frost-heaved section of track 11 miles south of the installation. The derailment was not severe, no one was injured, but the track repair required equipment and materials that could not reach the site until the derailed locomotive was removed, a process that the rail company's maintenance crew estimated at 10 days minimum. The installation's coal reserve at the time of the derailment was sufficient for approximately 4 days of reduced operations. On the 4th of February, with the coal reserve exhausted and no resupply accessible, now the remaining 2 operational boilers were shut down in a controlled cooling procedure that Makinen supervised personally. He recorded the shutdown times in the maintenance log with the same spare notation that characterized every entry he had made. Boiler 1, offline at 14:23. Boiler 2, offline at 14:51. The workforce was released over the following week, as transport could be arranged on the supply spur once the derailment was cleared. Most men left with whatever wages were owed to them through the shutdown date, paid in company script that was accepted at the company store and at reduced value at establishments in the nearest town, 31 miles south. A small maintenance crew of 12 men remained through February and into March, nominally to secure the installation and prepare it for the repair assessment that the consortium's board had not yet formally decided to commission. The board meeting on the 14th of February lasted 4 hours. The repair cost estimates that Makinen had obtained from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati suppliers totaled between $420,000 and $510,000, depending on whether the drive shaft housing was repaired or replaced. Against this, the consortium's own revised timber resource assessment, conducted hurriedly in January using Vriel's methodology, which they were now willing to apply with the urgency they had previously declined, estimated the remaining accessible timber volume at approximately 48 million board feet. At prevailing mill prices, this represented a gross revenue potential of approximately $920,000. Against repair costs, operating costs for a reduced final season, and transportation and decommissioning expenses, the net return from resuming operations was calculated at between $210,000 and $280,000. The consortium voted 6-1 against repair. Roland Petch, one who cast the single dissenting vote, argued in the meeting minutes that the precedent of abandoning a major installation without exhausting its resource potential would damage the consortium's reputation with future investors. The majority position, articulated by the board chairman in a sentence that the minutes record with this unusual completeness, was, "The resource is effectively exhausted. The machine has served its purpose. Further investment cannot be justified." The maintenance crew was discharged in March. The installation was abandoned in place. The supply rail spur was pulled for salvage by the rail company, which held a lien on the track materials in April and May of 1903. The access road, unpaved and unmaintained, was impassable by the following autumn. By the winter of 1903, the Iron Giant was unreachable by any practical means available to the men who had built it or operated it or invested in it. The snow fell around its cold boiler house and its silent platform and its 63 miles of abandoned rail, and the forest that it had consumed did not return to soften what it had left behind. Maps lie through omission. They record what exists and leave unmarked what has ceased to exist, which means that a map made in 1890 of the Upper Michigan interior and a map made in 1905 of the same territory share coordinates and contour lines and watercourse notations, while describing in every human and ecological sense entirely different worlds. The 1890 Federal Survey maps of the Meridian Timber Zone showed a continuous forest canopy across 412,000 acres. The canopy notation, the standard hatching that cartographers use to indicate standing timber, covered the plateau from its southern edge, where the supply rail line entered the territory, to its northern limit at the watershed divide that separated the Lake Superior drainage from the interior river systems. The hatching was dense and uniform. All to a reader familiar with the notation conventions, it communicated old-growth forest, multi-story canopy, closed crown, root systems interlocked below ground, in the mycorrhizal networks that stabilize forest soils against the erosive forces that wait, with geological patience for the canopy to open. The 1905 survey maps of the same territory showed something that the cartographic conventions of the period had no established notation for. The hatching was gone across the central plateau, replaced by the notation for open ground, which in the context of the Upper Peninsula's sandy glacial soils meant something more specific and more damaging than a simple absence of trees. It meant exposed mineral soil. It meant slash fields. The debris of extraction, dried now through 2 summers into a landscape of gray, weathered wood that held no moisture and supported no regenerative ground cover. It meant erosion channels cutting into the sandy substrate where the root networks had been removed, carrying the thin organic layer that 5 centuries of forest decomposition had built into the streams that ran off the plateau, turning those streams turbid and warm in ways that eliminated the brook trout populations that had inhabited them. The maps showed contour lines and watercourse locations with perfect geometric fidelity. They showed nothing of what had been lost. The human geography of the region had undergone an equally complete transformation that the maps also did not record. The small settlement communities that had existed in the timber zone's periphery, supply villages, boarding house clusters, the marginal agricultural operations that had fed the logging camps through the active extraction years, began their contraction almost immediately after the Iron Giant's closure. Population figures for the 3 townships most directly adjacent to the former Meridian operational zone show a collective decline of 63% between the 1900 federal census and the 1910 census. The county tax base, heavily dependent on the timber industry's payroll and the commercial activity it generated, fell by 40% in the same decade. The men who had worked the Iron Giant dispersed across the industrial geography of the upper Midwest, in patterns that no document formally recorded. Some followed the residual logging operations that continued in more distant and marginal timber zones. Some went to the copper mines of the Keweenaw, where the industry had recovered temporarily from the contraction of the early 1890s. Some went further west, to the timber regions of Minnesota and Wisconsin, where the same cycle of extraction and exhaustion was proceeding on a parallel timeline. A few went to the automobile industry that was beginning to organize itself in Detroit and its surrounding towns, offering wages that the timber industry had never matched, and working conditions that were different in their particulars but recognizable in their fundamental structure. Edmund Carruthers, the forestry surveyor, whose 1899 depletion report had been acknowledged and ignored by the Meridian Consortium, submitted a follow-up report to the Michigan State Land Office in 1906 that assessed the ecological condition of the former Meridian operational zone. His findings were detailed and, in places, expressed with a controlled anger that is unusual in professional survey documents of the period. He noted that natural regeneration of pine on the cutover lands was occurring at a rate that his calculations projected would require between 80 and 120 years to produce merchantable timber, and that was contingent on the prevention of the recurrent fires that were sweeping the slash-covered cutover regions with increasing frequency. Each fire resetting the regeneration timeline and further degrading the soil organic matter that new seedlings required. He noted that the stream systems draining the plateau had experienced measurable changes in their thermal and sediment characteristics that were adversely affecting fish populations throughout the watershed, including in sections of stream that lay outside the former operational zone and had not been directly logged. He noted that the wind erosion of the exposed sandy soils on the plateau's higher elevations was creating conditions that, if unaddressed, would result in permanent loss of agricultural potential across thousands of acres that had never been farmed, but that represented, in the longer view of regional land use, a resource that the logging industry had effectively destroyed without ever intending to exploit. His report was received by the State Land Office, filed and not acted upon. August Vreel read a summary of Carruthers' 1906 report in a professional engineering journal. He was 53 years old. Vreel and Hauser Mechanical Engineering had continued its work through the intervening years. Industrial installations, processing equipment, a series of contracts with the emerging electrical utility industry that had given the firm a more stable revenue base than the volatile timber industry had ever provided. Morris Hauser had retired in 1904. Dieter Kloss had become a full partner. Vreel wrote a letter to Carruthers in December of 1906, care of the State Land Office. The letter has survived in a Michigan archive, though Carruthers' response, if any was made, has not. Vreel wrote, "Ode in part, I read your assessment of the Meridian Zone with the recognition of a man who knew the outcome before it occurred and could not prevent it. I do not write to excuse the machine or its designers. The machine performed as designed. That, I have come to understand, was precisely the problem. A system engineered for total extraction, deployed against a finite resource, produces total extraction. This is not a flaw in the engineering. It is the engineering made fully visible. The flaw was in the decision to build such a system in such a place, and that decision was not an engineering decision." He did not write further on the subject, at least not in any document that has been recovered. He continued his professional practice for another 11 years, until his death in 1917. His obituary in the Cincinnati Engineering Society's newsletter mentioned the Iron Giant in a single sentence, describing it as a technically distinguished installation whose operational history raised questions of resource management beyond the strict purview of mechanical engineering. It was, as epitaphs go, accurate and insufficient in equal measure. The Iron Giant left no monument. This is not a metaphor. There is no historical marker at the site of the Meridian installation, no commemorative plaque affixed to the remnant concrete of the boiler house foundation, no designation in any state or federal register of historically significant industrial sites. The physical remains of the installation, the foundation mat, the scattered ironwork too heavy to be worth salvaging, the brick chimney stack that stood until 1931 before weather and frost heave finally brought it down, passed through decades of administrative indifference and were eventually absorbed into a state forest management unit whose official documentation makes no reference to what preceded the trees that now grow, thin and young and ecologically impoverished across the former operational zone. The forest returned, but not the forest that had been taken. This distinction matters with a precision that the casual observation of green canopy does not reveal. The white pine old growth that the Iron Giant consumed across 5 operational seasons was a biological community assembled over centuries. Not merely trees of a particular species, but a structured ecosystem in which species composition, canopy architecture, soil chemistry, hydrology, and the invisible networks of fungal symbiosis that connect root systems across acres of ground had reached a state of complexity and stability that ecologists, using terminology developed long after the events described here, call climax forest. It is the endpoint of ecological succession, the condition a forest achieves when it has been left, for long enough, to become fully itself. What grew back on the Meridian cutover was not climax forest, and will not be climax forest within any time frame that a living human being can expect to witness. The soils that the old-growth root networks had stabilized for centuries were partially eroded before any regeneration could begin. The seed source for white pine regeneration, which requires living mature pines within a reasonable dispersal distance to provide the seed rain that establishes new cohorts, had been eliminated across too large an area for natural reseeding to proceed uniformly. The species that colonized the cutover first were not pine, but aspen and birch, and the shrubby fire-adapted vegetation that opportunistically occupies disturbed ground, biologically valuable in its own right, but not the forest that had stood there before, and not capable, within human timescales, of becoming it. The ecological wound, in other words, was not temporary. It was a permanent alteration of the landscape's trajectory, a redirection of the centuries-long process of forest succession onto a different path that will take, by the most optimistic estimates of contemporary forest ecologists, 300 to 500 years, to return to something approaching the biological complexity of what was destroyed in 5 operational seasons. This is the Iron Giant's most consequential legacy, not the financial loss of the investors, which was real but bounded and eventually absorbed into the general record of capitalist miscalculation. Not the displacement of the workforce, which was severe but individual and eventually resolved through the mechanisms, inadequate, often brutal but functional, of industrial labor mobility. But the most consequential legacy was the permanent impoverishment of a landscape that had taken geological time to build and industrial time to destroy. The regulatory response to this legacy was slow, partial, and arrived too late to affect the specific catastrophe it was shaped by, as regulatory responses to industrial destruction almost invariably do, emerging from the wreckage of one disaster in time to partially prevent the next. Michigan's first meaningful timber conservation legislation, passed in 1903, established nominal restrictions on clear-cutting practices and required logging operators to leave seed trees in harvested zones. The legislation was poorly enforced and contained exemption provisions that rendered it largely ineffective against large-scale industrial operations. More substantive federal engagement with forest conservation, led by the Pinchot-era Forest Service in the first decade of the 20th century, created the institutional framework for sustained yield management that eventually stabilized the worst of the extraction economy's excesses. But this framework took decades to fully implement and did not restore what had already been lost. The Iron Giant's story entered the professional literature of forestry and conservation through the back door of case study, rather than through any formal recognition of its significance. Carruthers' 1906 report was cited in several subsequent studies of cutover land ecology in the Great Lakes region. Vreel's operational reports were referenced in a 1912 engineering monograph on industrial system design that used the Meridian installation as an example of what the author termed, with a careful neutrality that suggested awareness of how contentious the observation might be, the engineering of systems whose designed efficiency exceeds the ecological carrying capacity of their resource base. This phrase, and the concept it expressed, was not yet part of the mainstream vocabulary of industrial planning in 1912. It would not become so for another half-century when the accumulation of similar catastrophes across similar resource systems in similar geographic contexts finally produced, in the environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s, a political and scientific vocabulary adequate to naming what men like Vreel and Carruthers had observed and documented in the field decades earlier. The men who worked the giant left a different kind of legacy, diffuse, personal, largely unrecorded. Some of them carried their injuries forward, the missing fingers, the damaged hearing, the chronic back and joint conditions that sustained heavy industrial labor produces in the human body, with the same reliability that sustained extraction produces in a landscape. George Trant, the physician's assistant who had treated their injuries and noted his private concerns in the margins of his official log, left the Upper Peninsula after the installation's closure and established a small medical practice in a town in the Lower Peninsula. He died in 1931. His injury log and personal notes were donated to a historical society by his daughter in 1956. Toivo Mäkinen, the maintenance supervisor whose structural warnings had been deferred and whose shutdown of the final boilers had been performed with the quiet authority of a man doing the last thing he could do correctly in a situation where most things had already gone wrong, returned to Finland in 1905. He worked as a mechanical maintenance supervisor in a paper mill in Tampere for 20 years. In 1926, in a letter to a former colleague in Michigan, whose name does not appear in any other surviving document, he wrote, "I think often of the machine, not with regret for having worked it. A man works where he is. I think of it because I have never since worked on a thing so large that was so completely finished. Most machines break down. This one completed itself. There is a difference, and I have never found the right word for it." He was looking for a word that his era did not yet possess. The word is unsustainable. But that word, in 1926, had not yet accumulated the specific gravity of meaning that subsequent decades of industrial reckoning would load into it. Mäkinen felt the thing the word describes. He simply had to wait for the language to catch up. Harold Bjornsson, who had maintained the operational log through 5 seasons with his characteristic 3-line economy and who had received Vreel's final warning and chosen not to alter the operational schedule, retired to a farm in Minnesota in 1904. He did not speak publicly about the Meridian installation in any recorded context. His operational ledgers, the most complete documentary record of the Iron Giant's day-to-day function, were discovered in a farm estate sale in 1947 and acquired by a Michigan Historical Society that recognized their significance without fully understanding their context. They were cataloged, stored, and only systematically studied beginning in the 1980s, when a graduate student in environmental history at the University of Michigan named Patricia Vollmer wrote a dissertation on the timber extraction economy of the Upper Peninsula that placed the Meridian installation within the broader pattern of industrial resource exhaustion that had shaped the region's ecological and economic landscape. Vollmer's dissertation, published as a monograph in 1987, was the first scholarly work to treat the Iron Giant as a case study in what she termed the industrial logic of ecological foreclosure, the process by which a system optimized for extraction, deployed against a finite resource, forecloses the possibility of any alternative future use of that resource by consuming it completely before the consequences of that consumption can generate a corrective response. The phrase ecological foreclosure is more precise and more damning than anything Vreel or Carruthers or Mackinnon wrote, because it had the benefit of 80 years of hindsight and a theoretical framework that their era was in the process of generating through the accumulation of exactly these kinds of disasters. But the substance of what Vollmer named had been understood, in practical terms, by every man who stood on the observation platform above the boiler house and watched the tree line recede week by week across the gray Michigan sky. They knew. The knowing was not the problem. The problem was the structure, financial, contractual, organizational, within which the knowing existed and against which it had no effective force. This is the lesson that the Iron Giant teaches, if lessons can be extracted from catastrophe without the extraction itself, becoming a kind of violence against the complexity of what occurred. Not that industrial ambition is inherently destructive, not that engineering is culpable for the uses to which it is put, but that systems designed for maximum extraction, deployed without mechanisms for restraint, they will extract maximally, and that the consequences of this extraction are borne not by the systems or the investors who deploy them, but by the landscapes they consume and the people who inhabit those landscapes long after the investors have moved on to the next available resource and the next available machine. The Iron Giant is gone. The forest it consumed is not yet back. The men who fed it are all dead now, their specific experiences dissolved into the general anonymity of industrial labor history, present in aggregate statistics and absent as individuals, which is the characteristic fate of those whose work was essential and whose names were not recorded in the documents that subsequent generations chose to preserve. What remains is the concrete foundation, cracked now by frost and root intrusion, sinking slowly back into the glacial soils that Vreel spent so much careful engineering effort to stabilize against. And the young trees growing thin and pale above it, decades away from anything resembling the forest that stood here before, centuries away from what that forest was. The snow fell on the third morning without sound. It falls still, on concrete that has held its shape longer than the company that poured it, on iron that rust is slowly returning to the earth, on young trees that do not know what stood here before them, reaching upward through an absence they will spend centuries learning to fill. The giant is gone. The silence it left behind is not the silence before it came. It is something heavier, something that knows the difference.